Today on Uncommon Knowledge, what to do about Iran's nuclear revolution.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, the nuclear crisis in Iran. Iran, the same country that 25 years ago took American diplomats hostage and whose leaders routinely refer to the United States as the Great Satan, is now on the verge of developing nuclear weapons. How worried should we be? Are there any signs at all that Iran will not always be our adversary? What, if anything, can we do about it? Joining us today, two guests. Larry Diamond is a fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of political science at Stanford University. Abbas Milani, also a fellow at the Hoover Institution, is a former professor of law and political science at Tehran University. James Fallows in The Atlantic magazine, quote, "Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, and unless its policy is changed by the incentives it is offered or the warnings it receives, it will succeed," close quote. True, Larry?
I'd say inevitably true.
Inevitably true, regardless of warnings or incentives.
Inevitably, if we do not use a smart policy to stop it.
Abbas?
I think it's definitely the truth, and it might already be too late in the sense of trying to stop it.
All right. Let me begin with a provocative point. Columnist Hugh Hewitt, quote, "Allowing Iran to have nukes is tantamount to allowing a very horrible war, a war that will probably destroy the state of Israel, to take place at some unknown point in the future. The mullahs are on their way out, whether it be this year or in the next few years, but as they go out, the temptation for them to save themselves by doing something they believe is their religious duty, destroy the Jews, will be enormous," close quote. Is that something that the United States should be concerned about? A nuclear Iran will be extremely sorely tempted to attack Israel?
Well, first of all, I very much question the truth of the statement, and that religiously they are required to kill the Jews. There's nothing in Islam that says they should kill the Jews. In fact, before this regime came, Iran was one of the safest places for Jews to live in.
But isn't there an anti-Semitic strain in what the mullahs themselves preach? And I'm not trying to cast aspersions on Islam, but in what they preach. Isn't there an anti-Semitic strain in that or not?
There is certainly anti-Semitism in what the mullahs preach, but they preach it for political purposes, and they preach it because they want to get mileage in the Middle East. But there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about Islam. In fact, Islam historically has been very tolerant of Jews.
Is a nuclear Iran dangerous for Israel?
The answer is yes, of course, which is why the Israelis are seriously contemplating a preemptive strike if the Iranian nuclear program is not halted by negotiations within the next year to 18 months. But let me say, Peter, the Iranian nuclear program is dangerous for two other reasons that I think are even more sobering. What worries me about Iran going nuclear is, first of all, the very serious possibility that this will completely undermine the nuclear non-proliferation regime, and it will burst open the door to another 10 or 15 countries going nuclear, including several others in the Middle East, not least Saudi Arabia. Now, at some point, if you have not 2 or 3 rogue states, North Korea and Iran with nuclear weapons, but 5, 7, 8 states that are either disrespectful of international norms or could be, in the case of Saudi Arabia, overtaken by radical actors who are disrespectful of international norms, they could transfer one of these bombs to a terrorist group. And the ultimate security nightmare for the United States is not an Iranian missile or a North Korean missile coming over the horizon into an American city with a nuclear bomb, because we're going to know where it came from, it's going to have a return address, and that capital would no longer exist. The ultimate nightmare is that what happened on September 11th is going to happen at some point in the next few years with a nuclear bomb that will wipe out downtown Washington or downtown Manhattan.
Is a nuclear Iran something that the Bush administration, any American administration, if Kerry had won, something that an American president should simply judge unacceptable?
I think the administration has declared that this is unacceptable. They have repeatedly declared that they are not going to accept it. But what they will not accept, and what might have happened already on the ground because of policies that have been pursued in the past 5 or 6 years, are two different things. In other words, it might well be that because there was a failure to develop a coherent policy in the United States, because there was a failure in Europe to make a very serious attempt at stopping this program, and because there was a failure in the Iranian opposition to engage in this. In other words, nobody has really seriously talked to the Iranian people about the positive and negative aspects of this. It might be too...
You have now...
Can I just say, we need to be very careful in our use of language. If we say this is unacceptable, we are the most powerful country in the world. It means we can't accept it. It means we need to do anything, including invading Iran and displacing the regime, in order to make clear that we will not accept it.
That is exactly what I mean when I ask the question.
And I know, and that's why I wanted to be clear in the response. I think we need to make clear that Iran and the people of Iran will pay, unfortunately, a very heavy price in terms of isolation from the world, and a loss of a lot of the economic and social opportunities that await this country in integration into the world if they go down this route.
That's a soft option.
Larry is talking about a soft option, isolation. What about the military options?
James Fallows, quote, "The problem is that Iran's nuclear program is now much more advanced than Iraq's was at the time of the Osiris raid." That's when Israel took out a reactor. "Already the United States government has no way of knowing exactly how many sites Iran has, or how many it would be able to destroy, or how much time it would buy in doing so." Close quote. That is to say, a set of surgical strikes is already impossible, implausible. How would you judge it?
Well, I think there is good evidence to indicate that the Iranians, in anticipation of the possible strike, have dispersed their sites. There are report anywhere between 100 to 200 sites that could be potentially centers for this kind of a...
And that's an unworkable problem from the military point of view.
From, defense and security analysts, what the president is hearing is that the military options are not very good.
If they're
they
not
do
good
not
for us,
assure anything like the probability of success that Israel achieved with the Osiris strike.
So when you said a moment ago that Israel itself is threatening to take out these sites, Israel's not likely to have any more success than we. That's bluster, isn't it?
I don't think it's bluster.
That is to say, they're serious about making an effort.
You're right, but it's not likely that they would have prolonged success in derailing the program.
But that represents a new danger in itself. Israel, when they went into Iraq, they knocked out the program. It was clean, so to speak. If they go into Iran and only knock out half of the program, and they have a much richer, bigger country than Iraq,
and consider what will happen if there is a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. And Abbas, I know, can elaborate on this. But let me say, first of all, Iran will withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and will claim that they now have justification to develop nuclear weapons as a means of self-defense. Secondly, the population will rally around this regime in a dramatic nationalist cause.
You'd agree with that?
I think it'd be a disaster.
There's a lot of evidence that that has already happened. In fact, the way this argument has been pitched, you can read in Time magazine, you can read in the BBC report, that there has been a kind of a coalition of forces in Iran in favor of the regime, because people feel that the West's position is an untenable, unfair position. Why is Brazil allowed to develop a peaceful nuclear program and Iran is not?
Because the people who run Brazil are not crazy.
Well, right, but that's not the way.
You're not going to want Brazil to have the right to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium either.
Larger operation than a pinpoint strikes. James Fallows again. In circumstances of all-out war, the United States could mount an invasion of Iran if it had to, But as a tool to slow or stop Iran's progress toward nuclear weaponry, the available military options are likely to fail in the long term, close quote. Why should they be likely to fail? If we can replace the regime in Afghanistan and replace the regime in Iraq, why should we be unsuccessful in doing so in Iran?
Iraq has 25 million people, and look at how bogged down we are now there. We have 150,000 coalition troops in Iraq. We probably needed at the end of the war and need now twice that number.
Population of Iran is 60 million.
3 times that.
About 70.
70 million.
And the size of the country and the kind of terrain that you have, half of it is mountainous terrain. It's
said that Iraq is the same size as California. Iran's closer to Texas. We're talking about a very large area, right?
It's more so the population, the size of the population and the armed forces that we would confront, and the popular rallying against foreign invasion.
And last but not least, you have to remember that Europe has been very, very unambiguous that they're not going to support this. Jack Straw,
British Foreign Secretary,
says, under no circumstances, this is, I'm almost verbatim quoting him, and the Iranians read this.
So our best ally in Iraq says no way in Iran. All right.
Our guests argued that the military options are not feasible. So what other options do we have?
I'm going to quote you, Abbas, and an article you wrote together with Mike McFall. In the long run, the world's only serious hope for stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons is the development of a democratic government in Tehran. How do we do that?
Well, luckily, half of the problem is already solved. And that
good news at last.
That's the good news, that there is a democratic movement in Iran. There is a very viable democratic movement in Iran. This movement was truly on the verge of trying to dislodge this regime 2 years ago. When this regime was on the rope, they were absolutely intimidated. They were frightened by the presence of U.S. forces.
So the first year or so after September 11th, our response in Afghanistan and Iraq particularly Iraq, initially was having a salutary effect in Iran. It was strengthening the hand of the pro-democracy forces.
The first 3 weeks after the invasion of Iraq, I have never seen the Islamic regime as timid, as afraid, as willing to cooperate.
Why, though? Because if the military prospect of moving on from Iraq to Iran is as daunting as you just laid out, what were they afraid of? They couldn't have thought they were going to be next, because they knew that the military situation was just as difficult as the two of you just laid it out.
Now remember, the first 2 weeks, the United States had absolutely walked over Iraq. Then within 2 weeks, they had dismantled the Iraqi army that the Iranian could not dismantle in 8 years. The U.S. did it in 8 days. I would be frightened of them, of course.
Well, so what you're saying is,
the situation looked a little different a year ago.
Yeah, but what you're saying is there is the military option. There's some pressure that could be brought to bear.
Peter, not even the hardest neoconservatives are seriously arguing that we should have a land invasion of Iran. A preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities to buy time. People are seriously arguing,
saying that.
But the weight of opinion is that it will not be effective, and it will have these calamitous political blowback effects.
All right, so tell me what happened. During those first 3 weeks, they were frightened. The mullahs were frightened.
Very much so.
That strengthened the hand of the democratic movement in Iran. And then what happened afterwards? What has happened since?
I think you can draw a kind of a graph as the U.S. involvement got more and more complicated, as the number of U.S. casualties increased, as the insurgency gained power, some of it maybe with the help of the Iranians. The regime in Iran became more and more intransigent. They began to feel their oats. They began, like now.
Very much so.
So the corollary of what you're saying is that at least that one clear step that George W. Bush ought to take with regard to Iran is to succeed in Iraq.
It would help.
It would help. What else?
I think that the strategy is clear. You know, the Hoover Institution had very recently a pair of conferences on Iran's nuclear program. And I'd say we had some considerable consensus among a number of experts that the only strategy that offers a realistic hope of at least suspending Iran's program of nuclear weapons development is a strong, coordinated strategy between Europe and the United States of enhancing the carrots by having the United States put more incentives on the table, including...
what carrots?
For example, lifting of the economic embargo, a process of beginning to arrange for Iran's entry into the World Trade Organization, if it makes the internal reforms that would be needed for that, which would be very salutary for the eventual democratization of the country. And Europe needs to get serious about the sticks it would deploy if Iran doesn't negotiate. Now, that type of agreement...
Let me just ask, now these incentives are directed toward the mullah. In other words, what you'd want is a repeat of Libya. The mullahs remain in place, but they begin to behave better?
But you see, here is the difference. In contrast to Libya, and Abbas could talk about this at greater length, there is a serious democratic opposition inside Iran. There's a great deal of political pluralism. And I think very strongly, Abbas may disagree, that opening up Iran to the world with economic exchange, with an American embassy on the ground in Tehran, with greater exchanges between Iranian civil society and American civil society, greater flows of students and ideas, would help to till the soil for democratic change in this country.
You'd agree with that?
Absolutely, I agree. I think the embargo is hurting the Iranian people, it's hurting the American companies, and it's essentially strengthening the hands of a very small clique of people who are around the power and offering an excuse for the regime to cover up its economic failures.
So the carrots would be largely economic, but you mentioned that the Europeans have to get serious about the sticks that they would use.
In other words, if Iran resists a responsible policy in terms
nuclear policy
of clearly foregoing the enrichment of uranium or the reprocessing of plutonium, without which they can't develop a nuclear bomb, if they're not willing to agree to verifiable steps in those regards, Europe has to get serious about imposing significant sanctions on the regime leaders, on their assets, on their ability to travel to Europe, as well as the ability of Iran to do business in Europe.
Now, you say if...
Next, the role of Iranian public opinion.
And the reason that we should so hope the Europeans pull themselves together and deal effectively with Iran is that Iran is now, because public opinion has now shifted against the United States, that they're going to be more willing to deal with the... Why are you emphasizing the role of the Europeans here?
Well, first of all, public opinion has not shifted against the United States in Iran yet. Public opinion is predominantly favorable to the United States. Public opinion is, in fact, very critical of Europe. Iranians think...
And you base this on... There's no polling that's done.
Oh, there is some polling.
Oh, there is some polling.
A couple of polls.
And you're in touch by email. You're talking to dissidents in Iran all the time.
I'm doing that. I mean, we have
what they write in the newspapers.
Okay. In other words, it's an open enough society so that you can develop an informed feel for what's going on.
There is a lot of anecdotal evidence. I mean, you can read everyone from Christoph to Friedman, journalists who have gone to Iran, a couple of polls that have been done in Iran. All of these indicate that of all the Muslim countries in the world, the only place where the people are predominantly pro-American is Iran. The Iranian people are very different than the Iranian government. And that's a very important point.
So one piece of fixed advice is the goodwill of the Iranian people is an asset we should not blow.
Precious asset, and
whatever you do, hold on to that. Is that right?
And this relates to a key guidepost of our strategy. The Iranian people are very anti-regime and very pro-American, but they're also very nationalistic and proud people.
Right.
And they don't want to be told by the United States or anybody else that they can't have nuclear weapons when another country in the region has it and when other emerging countries seem to be after it. So we need to pursue a strategy, Peter, of very smart, very ambitious, and I might say very respectful public diplomacy that reaches out to the Iranian people and explains why we're not targeting Iran. We're trying to save the global nuclear non-proliferation program. And we need to portray to the Iranian...
What does public diplomacy mean, Larry?
It means talking to publics abroad and not just governments abroad. It means the people of the United States and the government of the United States directly talking to and engaging the Iranian people.
So you're the State Department, for example, it means the State Department putting out a couple of papers that explain rationally, away from any kind of a priori political judgments. Why economically it does not make sense, for example, for Iran to develop.
Or strategically.
What about a sort of Radio Free Europe or Radio Marti kind of effort for Iran? Should
We are strongly in favor of that.
That makes sense?
But what we are emphasizing in some of the work that Abbas and I are doing now is that such a radio station has to be independent of any political party or objective. It can't be supporting one political party. It can't be supporting a restoration in Iran. It can't be supporting for or against the restoration of the monarchy. It has to be focused most of all on the independent, unbiased conveyance of news and information, as well as basic democratic ideas and values. It has to have credibility if it's going to be effective.
Okay, now let me ask you another question.
Finally, advice for the Bush administration.
Advice for President Bush. Short term, what should he do within the next 6 months with regard to Iran? Give me something specific, Abbas.
My suggestion would be, my guess is that the agreement that they have made with Europe is not going to hold. Because the Iranians
that the Mullah's agreement with Europe will not hold. They're going to move forward with their nuclear program.
They're going to move forward. They're going to invariably cheat, and they're going to get caught. They're already preparing public opinion for the cheating. They just announced last week in Iran that they have arrested some people who are trying to illegally import centrifuges in Iran and give Iran a bad name. Clearly, if you know the kind of politics that mullahs play, this is preparation for the time when they get caught. So they already have a track record saying that this is not us, this is some rogue element. So they're going to cheat on that. And when they cheat, the United States has then the opportunity, as Larry was suggesting, to get Europe on the same page with the United States. Iran's problem will not be solved unless Europe and the United States are on the same page.
Larry, let me say that I think there is growing concern in Europe about not just Iran getting nuclear weapons, but the point I made at the beginning, the potential for this development to totally breach and gut the global non-proliferation regime. And this gives us, I think, a real resource to bring in the Europeans into a common approach.
Longer term for Bush. Give me some objective way by which to judge this administration's policy toward Iran. 4 years from now, when George W. Bush leaves office, what must be different in your judgment?
Oh, Peter, that's tough. Obviously, the greatest success would be if we had brought a verifiable halt to the nuclear weapons development program and a freer Iran. Those are the two objectives.
And those are both within reach. Those are both plausible.
The first is plausible in the near term, at least a suspension that holds as a result of a structure of carrots and sticks, incentives and sanctions. The second, we don't know when a moment may arise, as in Ukraine, as in Czechoslovakia, as in so many other countries that suddenly had a democratic moment. We don't know what event, what split in the regime, what development might trigger it.
That's what we're waiting for. We have to be alert to a democratic moment.
Exactly, and we have to till the soil. And I think one thing very specific that would help would be to take a certain appropriation of money to establish a truly independent radio station that would not be controlled by the United States government, that would not be controlled by any political force, but would simply give the Iranian people independent news, information, and democratic hope and ideas.
All right, television, so we have to wrap it up. Prediction. 4 years from now, will Iran have nuclear weapons? What do you think?
Yes, I think 4 years from now, Iran will have a nuclear.
Larry?
I'm not willing to throw in the towel. I honestly don't know, but I think it is potentially preventable and a goal worth working for.
4 years from now, will Iran be, I'm not asking necessarily whether a democratic revolution will have taken place, but will Iran be more or less democratic?
If you give me a little longer than 4 years, I can tell you with some certainty that in not a too distant future, Iran will be democratic.
It's generational. The bad guys will die off sooner or later?
It's more than generational. There is some fundamental economic problems that is going to break the back of this regime. There's some fundamental tensions that are arising within this regime. The Revolutionary Guards are becoming more powerful. They want a bigger share of the pie. They're very much vying for power. It is not all rosy, and you have 70% of the Iranian youth wanting democracy, wanting nothing to do with the theocracy. These are good news. You have an incompetent, economically corrupt system. You have an oil-rich country. You have a technocratically sophisticated Iranian society. You have a diaspora who is willing to help support the democracy.
Let me put it this way. If we do what we should do, what we must do, and what I think we can do to lead an energy revolution in the pursuit of alternative fuels, so that we bring down the price of oil from $50 a barrel to $25 a barrel. I think this regime is toast in the next 5 to 10 years, and I think we will see a wave of democratizing change throughout the Middle East.
Larry Diamond, Abbas Milani, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.